The fastest plane ever built leaked fuel onto the runway before every single flight. Pilots taxied past puddles of jet fuel that came from their own aircraft. This is why Lockheed designed it that way on purpose. To understand why a plane would be designed to leak fuel, you have to understand what it was built to do. By the late 1950s, the United States had a serious problem. Soviet radar networks were getting better. The U-2 spy plane, which flew at high altitude to avoid being shot down, was no longer safe. In May of 1960, a Soviet surface-to-air missile brought one down. The pilot was captured. It was a major embarrassment. The Central Intelligence Agency and the Air Force needed something new, not just faster, but so fast that no missile could catch it and no fighter could intercept it. They needed a plane that could cross the Soviet Union, take photographs, and disappear before anyone could stop it. The target speed was Mach 3. That is 3 times the speed of sound, roughly 2,000 miles per hour. No aircraft had ever been designed to cruise at that speed continuously, and when engineers at Lockheed Skunk Works division started doing the math, they found a problem nobody had solved before. At Mach 3, the outside of the aircraft gets very hot. Not warm, not uncomfortable. Hot enough to weaken aluminum, which is what almost every aircraft in the world was built from. They needed a completely different material, a completely different shape, and a completely different way of thinking about the aircraft's structure. And every solution they found created a new problem. When air hits a surface at Mach 3, friction heats it up fast. The leading edges of the SR-71, the sharp front parts of the wings and nose, can reach over 500 degrees Fahrenheit in sustained flight. Aluminum softens and loses its strength around 300 degrees. So aluminum was simply not going to work. Lockheed's engineers chose titanium. Titanium is strong at high temperatures, lightweight compared to steel, and does not corrode the way other metals do. It sounds like an obvious choice, but in 1958, titanium was extremely difficult to work with. The tools that cut it wore out fast. The welding techniques were not well developed, and titanium was expensive and rare. Lockheed ended up sourcing much of it, with some irony, from the Soviet Union through third-party countries. Here is the trade-off. Titanium solves the heat problem, but metal still expands when it gets hot. The SR-71's body grows by about 3.5 inches in total length during flight, as the entire airframe heats up and stretches. Engineers had to design every panel, every joint, and every fuel line to allow for that movement. On the ground, those gaps are real. That is part of why the fuel leaks. The tanks are not sealed tightly enough to hold fuel at room temperature, because if they were, the seams would be under dangerous stress once the aircraft heats up and expands at speed. The SR-71 used a special fuel called JP7. Compared to regular jet fuel, JP7 is much harder to ignite. That sounds like a problem for an aircraft engine, but it was actually a feature. At Mach 3, the air around the plane is so hot that a standard fuel would ignite just from contact with it. JP7 was stable enough to survive those conditions without catching fire on its own. But JP7 did something else too. The fuel was pumped through channels in the aircraft structure before reaching the engines. Think of it like the coolant in a car radiator, except the coolant is also your fuel. The fuel absorbed heat from the hottest parts of the airframe, cooled them down slightly, and then went into the engines already warmed up, which actually helped combustion. One substance was doing 2 jobs at the same time. The trade-off here was weight and complexity. The fuel system had to be engineered with far more precision than a normal aircraft. The pumps, the lines, the routing through the structure, all of it had to work perfectly at extreme temperatures and pressures. A failure in the fuel system was not just an engine problem, it was a thermal management problem. And because the aircraft leaked at takeoff, it also had to refuel in the air almost immediately after leaving the ground, once the airframe had heated up and the seals had tightened. A jet engine needs air, but at Mach 3, air is not the problem. Too much air, moving too fast, is the problem. If raw supersonic air enters a jet engine directly, it destroys the engine. The airflow has to be slowed down before it reaches the compressor blades inside. The SR-71 solved this with movable cones inside the engine inlets, called inlet spikes. These spikes could move forward and backward automatically during flight, controlled by a computer. Their job was to create a controlled shockwave, a zone where the supersonic air was compressed and slowed to a speed the engine could handle. Think of it like a funnel that turns a raging river into a calm stream before it enters a water wheel. At the right position, the inlet spike could actually capture energy from the shockwave and feed it into the engine as additional thrust. At Mach 3, the inlets themselves were producing a significant portion of the total thrust, not just the engines. But getting that balance wrong was dangerous. If the shockwave moved to the wrong position inside the inlet, something called an unstart would happen. The airflow through one engine would suddenly collapse. The aircraft would yaw violently to one side in a fraction of a second. Early pilots described it as being hit in the face with a baseball bat. Later versions added automatic restart systems to manage this, but unstart remained a known hazard throughout the aircraft's operational life. The SR-71 entered service with the United States Air Force in 1966. Its first operational missions were reconnaissance flights over North Vietnam and later the Middle East. The aircraft proved almost impossible to intercept. Over the course of its service life, more than 1,000 surface-to-air missiles were fired at SR-71s, not one hit. The standard tactic when a missile was detected was simple: accelerate. The SR-71 could outrun almost anything. Pilots would push the throttles, and the aircraft would simply pull away from the threat. In 1976, an SR-71 set the absolute airspeed record for a jet aircraft using air-breathing engines, 2,193 miles per hour at high altitude. That record still stands today, more than 40 years later. No aircraft with an air-breathing engine has ever flown faster in sustained level flight. The SR-71 was retired in 1990, brought back briefly in 1995, and retired again in 1998. The official reason was cost. Each flight hour was extremely expensive. Satellite reconnaissance had become good enough to reduce the need for crewed overflights, but the engineering it produced did not disappear. The variable inlet spike concept influenced later high-speed aircraft design. The thermal management approach, using fuel as a structural coolant, was studied and adapted for later programs. Engineers who study high-speed flight still return to the SR-71 because it is one of the very few aircraft that actually operated continuously at Mach 3. Not in a test dive, not in a brief burst, but in sustained cruise, mission after mission, for decades. The solutions its designers found, and the trade-offs they accepted, remain a reference point for anyone working on aircraft that operate at the edge of what materials and physics allow. The SR-71 leaked fuel because the engineers chose to let it, so the aircraft would survive. Sometimes the right design choice looks broken on the ground and only makes sense at speed. Subscribe if you want more Cold War engineering breakdowns every week.